Starship Ron Roper up for another day of, I would call it broadcast influence. That's what I would call it. All right, so many things that need to be addressed. We are going to start on the phones with you. No guest, all you at 591-8900. If you've been following this controversy about the shooting in California, near University of California, Santa Barbara on Friday night, this guy, the shooter, is, a deranged nutbag. No question about that. However, there is now everyone on the planet trying to come up with someone to blame for this. And it's gotten me sort of crazy because one of the groups that's being blamed, Judd Apatow and Seth Rogen, the makers of movies that the Washington Post has a story about, or an editorial, I should say, not a story, an editorial, a think piece, perspective piece, on who is to blame and why misogynistic movies are to blame for this. Everybody's trying to blame somebody, whether it's social media or it's youth in general, it's the gun culture, it's the liberals, it's the conservatives. It is as simple as a crazy guy got a hold of a knife, which he killed the first 3 people with a knife. Then he goes on a shooting rampage up and down the streets of this little seaside town in California, trying to cause as much trouble as he possibly can, running people over with his car, running people, confronting women outside the sororities, banging on the door of the sorority, claiming that he was a guy that in that video, and I'm sure many people have seen the video. I'm not going to play any of that because I think it just serves to further excite people who I don't really wish to excite. But in that video, he tells a story about how he's angry at all women. He's angry at all women for rejecting him. He's nuts. He's not, I mean, I hate to say it like this. I mean, he's not a terrible looking kid, wasn't a terrible looking kid, wasn't came from some means, right? His father was a director. People are also blaming the Hollywood culture for this as well. I heard Mr. Savage do that last night. I think that's a little misplaced, but you can debate me at 591-8900 if you so wish. The other issue, though, is him. He seemed like he's driving a BMW, comes from some money, not a bad-looking kid. So if everybody hates him, it is pretty much on him. It is on some personality trait that he's got, and maybe it is, and always was, mental illness. But that doesn't mean that everybody else on the planet is responsible. And what is it about our instinct to need to blame something we can't control? We need to come up with an explanation for it. But people think, well, in order to assert some sort of control in my life, I need to then come up with a reason for this, because I cannot look at the universe as random. I cannot look at this kind of violence as possible at any given time. It would drive me nuts. And that's a psychological reality. You cannot do that.
Yeah, Ro, one of the surprising things about this was Ann Hornaday, the Washington Post critic. You wouldn't think is the prototype to write a column like she wrote. You'd expect our colleague Michael Savage to go after Hollywood. But the so-called liberal, elitist, film critic, Washington Post writer, the leaps she made, and I think she had some points to make, and she's a wonderful writer. It was actually, I think, a terribly written piece that made a few good points really, really poorly. And then, of course, everything was exacerbated by the usual cycle of reaction. But this idea of, in this case particularly, as you mentioned, this is a good-looking kid who had everything going for him. And one of the things the Washington Post piece touched on was how all these movies by Judd Apatow, a lot of them starring Seth Rogen, show the schlub getting the girl. You know, that's the term she used. And she said that this would further anger a guy like this because he would think, well, even if the schlub can get the girl, why can't I? And that's such an illogical point to make.
Well, and sexist in and of itself.
Because and it's like, well, are you not as a feminist offended by 8 million romantic comedies in which women who have great friends, great jobs, great families, and are great looking are miserable because they haven't gotten the guy, which is the premise of every Katherine Heigl and every other romantic comedy that's come out for the last 15 years. If I don't have a man, I'm incomplete. That's what those movies are about. But if the schlub getting the girl was the point of this guy getting angry. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. George Costanza should be banned from the planet because for 10 years on Seinfeld, he was the schlub getting the girl. And I don't remember anybody getting angered by that and going out and committing any kind of crimes. As you said, it's all about mental illness. In 1999, you were on the air here. I was writing a column for the Sun-Times, and Columbine happened, and I was out there, and people started talking about the Trenchcoat Mafia and bands whose names have long since been forgotten that these guys cited in their journal, and even video games. And people started talking even then, we got to ban these games. Look what it caused these two guys to do.
Mm-hmm. Right, there were lawsuits.
Yeah, Klebold and Harris, the two killers. People were talking about, that's what pushed them over the edge. John Hinckley had a copy of Catcher in the Rye in his back pocket. So did Mark David Chapman when he shot John Lennon. It's the fault of the Catcher in the Rye, which has sold 65 million copies. And 4 idiots have cited it as the reason why they became violent. So let's blame the Catcher in the Rye.
This is Hornaday. This is Ann Hornaday's response. She went on Skype. She put this up through the Skype social media site and then also on YouTube.
The whole reason I weighed in on this issue was that he had created this video on YouTube that seemed to be such a product of the entertainment industry that he did grow up in, literally, and also just as a member of the culture. In singling out Neighbors and Judd Apatow, I by no means meant to cast blame on those movies or Judd Apatow's work for this heinous action. Obviously not.
So it's a well-made, viral-looking video. So what? That's such an odd launching point for blaming this on the Hollywood culture. She's talking about how he filmed it in magic hour and he was well lit. So what? So are 5,000 other videos put up by kids that age every day.
Right. And he did grow up in a household in which his father was an assistant director, in a number of films.
Hunger Games and a bunch of other films. Oh my God, the Hunger Games!
Well,
he worked on the Hunger Games.
Well, that's the thing is I heard that last night too, which is the Hunger Games is about teenagers killing teenagers. If you haven't read the books or seen the movie, then in a single line, yes, but that isn't what the books or the movie teaches. That's not the message, is it?
It's about teenagers killing teenagers because a Hitler-esque ruling government is forcing them into it. It's about oppression.
And it's an allegory for other crimes of the 20th century that occurred. And it's a cautionary tale of ways that governments can go bad in an apocalyptic futuristic world, right? Okay, let's go to the phones. 591-8900. We'll do that right after this. All right, to the phones we go, 591-8900. Everybody's looking for someone to blame in this case of the murder rampage in California last Friday night. And Hollywood seems to be the consensus lead right now in the blame game. To the phones we go. Joey, you're on WLS. Hi, Joey.
Good afternoon. Women have goofy magazines, too. Most of those women's magazines only have 2 main articles: what disgusting pigs men are, and how to get a man.
Actually, a lot of it has to do with self-pleasure, too. I don't know if I don't know how often you've been reading those. I read those every week when they come out. But there's that. Beauty tips. And I don't see a ton of, your man's a pig. I see a lot of, there is a lot of how to get a guy or how to please a guy or get a guy to please you. In, sort of a general sense.
You can have it all. Here, 10 quick steps to that.
Exactly.
Here's an airbrushed photo of an actress who has a staff of 6. Why can't you be more like her?
Right. And she's 62 and just had a beautiful bouncing baby boy.
Triplets, actually.
How'd that happen? Tom, you're on WLS. Hi, Tom.
Hey, good afternoon. Yeah, I think your premise is based on the fact that you've perhaps forgotten the American culture since the 1960s has done a really good job of eroding a sense of boundaries and self-inhibition. We no longer look at sublimation as a way of overcoming problems and deficits in our life. And in modern American culture, certainly substantiated by the film industry, the book industry, the drug issues, this young man may have had some very diagnostic mental illness,
mm-hmm.
but because he's grown up in a culture that has removed boundaries from developing inhibition and self-control, I think, what was he, 22 years old?
I believe that's the case, yeah.
Yeah, emotionally, he may not have been 22. He may not have been 22 years old. He may have had a tremendous amount of emotional harassment, attachment disorder issues coming out of a family structure.
I want to go back to something you're saying here, though. And I think everybody kind of, makes those kinds of assumptions. And in everyone's life, a kid who's just screwed up, right? There's either it's your kid, it's your niece, your nephew, the neighbors, the cousins, whatever. Somebody knows somebody who's got a problem with a kid who's got some sort of a disorder. Now, the question is, at what point how do the parents channel that, and to what degree do they take responsibility for that kid's disorder so that kid does not become a long-term problem or a problem to society in general? And now it's interesting, a little part of the story is that a month ago, these parents did reach out to authorities and say, hey, we got a problem with this guy. And he is, as you're pointing out, he's an emancipated adult, right? I mean, it's very hard. And once someone is past the age of maturity, they're past 18, it is almost impossible to throw them into someplace unless they have made a very visible threat or they have committed a crime, right? You can't get them into the system.
Yeah, well, see, my point is...
But I think there's too much, and this is what I want to get to your point, Tom.
Yeah.
I think your point is that there's too much sort of live and let live in the culture here, and there's not enough setting of boundaries for people. And I think that, that's one of those cross current messages that we have in our culture, which is this. If you're saying, I want freedom in my culture, I don't want the government to tell me what to do, I don't want authority to tell me what to do, then how do you justify that with setting a boundary against somebody who might be just a little off, might think differently, might say different things, might hate women for whatever reason that they hate them, and then do something about that when you're saying to them, no, get your hands off me?
Well, I work as a clinical counselor.
Clearly.
And my concern is this, that this culture is so chaotic. When what your point is well taken in terms of blame, I think people are blaming because there's a tremendous sense of chaos in this culture now. We've had a lot of these kinds of episodes where young people have gotten involved with these very tragic situations. Yeah. And it seems to be becoming, for the loss of a better word, epidemic. It's happening more frequently.
Well, it's certainly coming to our attention, and I got to run to some other callers here. Tom, and you're the caller of the month, by the way. I wish I had a prize for that, but I don't.
I want to make one quick point.
I love your program.
Hey, Tom,
every night.
I appreciate what you're saying. I don't disagree with Tom. One quick point, though, Ro. He mentioned the culture, and ever since the 60s, and that's true. Woodstock was 45 years ago. So if we're talking about the culture and a more free and anything goes society, we're talking about 75-year-olds who set the tone for that.
Right.
It's not this generation. It's their grandparents, actually.
No, that's an excellent
I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying that this has been the way for 60 years now.
Well, and I want to quickly, we talk about popular culture and movies and stuff like that. I think we need to go no further back than, 1500 and see and go back to, or the 1600s and go back to Shakespeare and say it's sex and death are the entertainment mediums that sell. Right. You're never going to take those out. And those have been in every film, and there's been an element of that.
They weren't playing patty cakes in the Coliseum.
Right. It's just part of it's part of the deal. And
the Lions are heavy favorites today against the Christians. Here's the point spread.
Yeah, and so violence as entertainment is definitely not a new concept,
itself.
Right? Or sex, or the idea of disenfranchisement.
Adam and Eve got the NC-17 label originally. Some nudity, violence.
Yeah, the entire Old Testament.
Hints of bestiality, temptation.
There's an interesting thing too that that's disgusting. What do
you think the snake was doing? Flirting with
All right, you know what? I'm going to have to talk to you off the air about this. I'm just going to talk to you. We'll come back to your phone calls.
Thursday morning with Bruce Wolf and Dan Propp. The president tries to put some feck in his foreign policy at 7:07.
And at 8:06, I'll give my first-person account of Blackhawks-Kings Game 5.
Thursday morning, Bruce Wolf, Dan Propp, 89 WLS.
All right, let's return to the phones at 591-8900. We're discussing this controversy that has now emerged in the aftermath of the shootings on Friday night in California. You have a deranged young man goes on a killing spree, stabbing 3 people, his roommates. Then he goes out in his BMW, 400 rounds of ammunition, starts shooting people, a couple of handguns, starts shooting people, causing all kinds of hell. Not only is he shooting people, he's also running them down with his car. And now, and the question appears to have morphed into some discussion of who's crazier than whom here. And I don't fully understand why that becomes, or who caused his insanity, as opposed to actually blaming the guy himself. The culture somehow has to come under attack. And I don't seem to understand why the culture is constantly to blame. We here in the United States have there is a violence issue in the United States. There's no question about that. And there are people in this society who've chosen to subjugate others, including themselves, their own sense of morality, their own sense of propriety. And those are issues. But is it Hollywood's problem? And there's so many people who are making this argument because it's somehow pop culture is to blame, that the world has been somehow altered by Hollywood in a way that just makes it so unbelievably violent.
Remember, of course, Ro, when John Hinckley was, of course, obsessed with Jodie Foster in the movie Taxi Driver, and had all kinds of extensive writings about that, and writings to Jodie Foster, and he was obsessed with the movie Taxi Driver, and he, of course, tried to assassinate and shot Ronald Reagan. And a couple of things there. I saw one of the pieces in response to this piece said, but the difference
the
is
Washington Post piece,
yeah,
really
a response to the Washington Post piece by another feminist writer who I actually like very much. She pointed out, she said, well, in the 70s, the movies had different consequences. And she cited Taxi Driver and said, Travis Bickle did not have a happy ending. And I'm like, no, that's actually not true. If you remember the movie Taxi Driver, spoiler alert, Robert De Niro plays a crazed taxi driver who goes on a killing spree and actually does get away with it, ends up being hailed as a hero, and the movie ends with him back driving his taxi, and the woman he's obsessed with getting in the cab, Sybil Shepherd. He does get away with it. But regardless of that, it's not up to the movies to give you endings that say violence is bad. You put your own interpretation on these things. Do they glorify violence? Of course they do. They did in the 30s too.
Well, they sell violence, right?
Well, and they often glorify it. There's no doubt about it. And they did in the 30s, and that's why there are all kinds of code and restrictions put on the Jimmy Cagney movies of 1938.
Tom, you're on WL. Say, Tom.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. Hey, so first of all, I'd like to pray for the kids and also this boy who killed these other individuals. He obviously, this isn't something where he just woke up and snapped one day. This has been coming on for a long time. And I think a lot of this, and I'm speaking as a father and what I see, that a lot of this starts with support in the family at a very young age. I believe we all have a crazy gene in us. That we all do stupid things as a kid and crazy things, but our parents, our mother, father, our neighbors, even our priests, they help us keep the boundaries. With what's right and what's wrong, and once in a while we cross that boundary, but then we have a mom and a dad who help us get back. And I'm afraid that right now.
Well, this guy did have a mom and a dad who did try to help.
Well,
and I mean that's a separate issue, which is what do you do when you have an adult child that goes off the reservation and you call authorities and they don't do anything about it? This is not dissimilar from. I mean, and they did, right? I mean, I think it's reprehensible. Sorry, Tom. Tom decided to not wish to be disagreed with.
Right.
But
he wanted to hang up and listen for your answer.
But there are parents here that did try to do the thing. This goes back to, and I know this is a strange analogy, but to the underwear bomber. Remember the underwear bomber's father, right? I believe he originally was in Nigeria. I think the underwear bomber, and he had family there, somewhere in West Africa. And his father basically called the U.S. consulate and said, hey, this kid's crazy and he's doing some nutty things. He's hanging out with the wrong people. I think he's a danger. And then what do you do about that? Because actually, if everybody who thought that their kids were potentially a danger, you'd have tens of thousands of cases in Chicago alone every day.
Absolutely.
And then what does does the society, not the culture, the society do about that? All right. Mary, you're on WLS. Hi, Mary.
Just two things. First, it's sad that we don't take enough time to mourn these young victims.
Very true.
We kind of get into the dissecting what happened, and I think the victims get lost.
True.
Second point is, I know there's been some studies done regarding the increased use of antipsychotic drugs. While they can help millions of people, they also come with high-priced side effects. People who are on these antipsychotic drugs and are lucky enough to be closely monitored, they are asked, do you have suicidal thoughts? Do you have any suicidal tendencies? I have personal experience with a family member.
But people often lie. I mean, that you're requiring them to tell the truth there.
Right, but that's why I'm just saying there's been studies done. What is so different nowadays besides the culture everyone talks about? It's also the increased use of antipsychotics. They have a purpose.
Well, I got to tell you,
I would like to know
that the antipsychotic drugs that you're talking about. There's dopamine reduction. There's different ways of different kind of active agents in these things that change people. There's a couple different mechanisms. There's one where it increases serotonin, then there's one that decreases serotonin. There's one that increases or decreases dopamine. All those chemicals that are when the synapse fires, that stuff that they shoot, the brain shoots across itself to allow us to do all the things that we're doing right now. Then the other one, which is an interesting one, that actually bifurcates the brain. It actually keeps signals from crossing the hemisphere from the left to the right as quickly as possible, because that has been related to erratic behavior. And so when you talk about those drugs, those for a lot of people, especially paranoid schizophrenics, have been miraculous for them. So I'm
talking about the small percentage of people.
But what are you going to do? I mean, you have 10 people who are going to be helped by it, and one person of those 10 that might not be as well aided by it or makes it worse. Believe me, you want those 10 psychotics to be treated, right?
Oh, right. I'm just saying it's something I would, wonder if they're paying attention to these statistics.
Well, what else are you going to do, though? I mean, I don't know what you want. You're going to take it all away because, there's 2%, 3% of the patients don't tolerate it? Well, you can't do that, right?
Well, I don't know. I just find the increased use of antipsychotics with the increase of these mass shootings and,
Well, let's talk about this because I'm glad you brought that up because, Mary, I think that's one of the issues that we have is this idea that there's mass shootings that are on the rise, that this is a new phenomenon, and that it's only over the last couple of years. Well, as we pointed out, Columbine is 15 years ago now, right? And before that, there have been
Charles Whitman and
yes, I mean people have gone to the bell tower, as they have said in the past. Workplace related shootings, things like that, mental illness. The issue is that urbanization, access to firearms in an urban environment, which is different. And when I say urban, I'm not talking about big cities necessarily. I'm talking about even smaller cities where people aren't living on the farm. They aren't separated from each other, and they are less reliant on each other. They're more reliant on the services that urbanization creates. It's easier to go to a restaurant and not to have to know anybody there. Mm-hmm. It's easier to go to the post. You don't know your postman anymore. You don't know. There's no milkman. There's none of that stuff. You're going to. There's a disassociation that individuals have with all that is around them. In Chicago, look around. I'll bet you on a city block in Chicago, you can't name more than 2 or 3 of your neighbors.
Absolutely true.
You live in an apartment building in Chicago. You can't name more than 2 or 3 of your neighbors. You just don't know. A lot
of suburban blocks, too. And a lot of,
good
old Main Street USA type towns. People don't know their neighbors like they used to.
So everybody so the disassociation creates a potential for an enemy at any given point. And we also disassociate from the violence of it. And we are not connecting to it. And yes, listen, I'm not saying that this is a problem that we should just throw up our hands and go, well, there's nothing we can do about it and move on. We do need to analyze it, but blaming these false totems and then harping on it over and over and over again, like the Hollywood culture is going to change, or video games or things like that, or even guns. Yeah, they sit around and harp about, if we just got rid of all the guns. You can't. You're not going to get rid of any of those things because there's real economies associated with those things. What we have to deal with is we have to have the schools, the parents, the churches, everybody in that social network teach the importance of human life and be each other's keeper, in the sense that that if somebody is going off the reservation, and these people are all mentally ill. There's a single case of any of these guys. This, whether it was Dylan Klebold or this, the guy in Aurora, Colorado. I mean, look at those mug shots. I mean, they're all crazy. Somebody has to step up, and there has to be, as much as there has been this response to domestic violence in the aftermath of OJ, right? Police arrive at any domestic violence situation, someone's going to be in handcuffs. Someone's going to leave that house for the night. The same has to be said of the mentally ill. And I know that the sheriff has been talking about this, that county jails need to be converted to some degree to handle the influx of people who are crazy, so they can be evaluated, either placed back on these meds or put into a system that gets them away and makes the rest of the culture safe.
When news breaks, turn to 89 WLS first to get the facts and form your own opinion. Chicago's talk leader, 89 WLS.
All right. We'll go back to the phone calls. One more phone on this, and then on to some other things today on this very radio program. Ron Majors is going to join us. Black Bears in Chicago, and the Cubs might not get their stadium redo. This breaking news, the city may kick this can down the road. Plus, news of the obvious. All coming your way in the 3 o'clock hour.
Really?
And Eddie Olczyk. Eddie Olczyk is going to join us.
The great Eddie O.
The Chicago hockey great, hockey Hall of Famer. He's calling the Montreal-New York series for NBC Sports. And oh my God, I don't know if you've been watching that. You talk about violence. Talk about the glorification of violence. You should see this series.
Could be a Canadian-U.S. skirmish there, out of control.
Yes, it could be. There could be a border war. All right, Jennifer, I got about 30 seconds, but I wanted you to make your point.
Hello?
Jennifer, go right ahead.
Hello? Oh, okay. Thanks so much. I just wanted to comment. I don't know if I missed a little bit of the story, but I run a domestic violence program where I've been for about 15 years. And in terms of your comments about OJ, it wasn't until after like 20 years of advocacy and laws changing that anything like that would happen in terms of someone being walked off in handcuffs. It used to be that they would just tell the perpetrator to go take a walk outside. So in terms of mental health law, also, I think instead of indicating that these things are as a result of psychotropic intervention, if you look at these mass shootings, many of these things are happening due to the lack of that intervention and lack of service. So I just wanted to share that point.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. All right. Thanks very much. Appreciate it, Jennifer.
Right.